This is shell shock, a horrific condition originally believed to have been caused by falling shrapnel that caused head injuries and led to symptoms such as these. Throughout the war, different medical discourse has been used to describe the traumatized condition, such as battle hypnosis, war neuroses, combat hysteria, male hysteria, and even just the simple term of exhaustion, in an effort to lessen the intensity of the diagnoses and get the soldier back to the front lines as soon as possible. Though these terms don't show up as frequently, the term shell shock has been present throughout the war and has been present in our vocabulary when we talk about World War I. My questions for you to consider are: what made the term shell shock so special, and how was it translated going from medical circles to war literature, from war literature to civilians back home? My proposed answer is that World War I reframed our understanding of trauma, and modernist themes helped in communicating this condition of the soldier to a civilian audience back home. It wasn't a new idea that physical trauma could have psychological effects. In fact, it was all we really understood about trauma, which is what made the definition of shell shock seem so fitting at first. This understanding comes from a case study from before the war. In 1848, in the middle of the Industrial Revolution, constructing railroads was extremely dangerous. One day, a railroad worker by the name of Phineas Gage was tapping gunpowder into the ground with an iron rod when the gunpowder ignited, and the rod was rocketed straight through his brain. Crazily enough, Phineas survived, but exhibited severe personality changes. Different accounts say that he was suddenly more irritable and moody. Phineas Gage was no longer himself. This case study displays the knowledge of trauma before World War I. Traumatic physical injury equals drastic behavior changes. Shell shock followed the same logic, but was soon found to be flawed in the definition of war. As more reports came in, it became clear that most soldiers rarely had concussive injuries. In fact, by the end of the war, it was reported that only 4 to 9% of soldiers diagnosed with shell shock were exposed to shell fire. Some argued the phrase also didn't fully encompass the emotional aspects, opting to call the trauma a hysteria instead. While others thought the condition was more physiological in nature, they labeled it war neuroses. And despite the controversy about the term shell shock and whether or not it was appropriate, shell shock was still how we described it. In my research, I found that it's not the term that was so special, but rather how it presented the traumatized condition in a way that the other terms couldn't. Authors of Shell Shock and A Cultural History of the Great War reason this by saying that the term shell shock bypassed the stigma associated with terms like hysteria or neurasthenia, connotating a condition arising out of psychological vulnerability. It allowed for soldiers to be free of the uncomfortable and feminine connotations of hysteria. Even Showalter agrees in her document, The Male Hysteria, stating that the term provides a masculine-sounding substitute for more feminine words such as hysteria. As shell shock prevailed as an unbiased term, it was one that was turned into a larger metaphor for the war experience. Other writers could use this when discussing topics of war. While its definition existed in medical files, it had another more ambiguous definition in literature that perpetuated the idea of the soldier's condition with the help of modernist themes. For some perspective, think back to the poem Charge of the Light Brigade by Lord Tennyson, and recognize that poetry before World War I was very different from war poetry. Even by looking at the first two stanzas, we see a traditional rhyme scheme, a use of flowery romantic language to communicate the point that what the soldier is doing is brave and noble, just as a soldier should be. There's no mention of the soldier personally, who he is, where he is, opting to focus on his action instead of his emotion. I think the most interesting thing to note about this is the author. Tennyson himself was a civilian. He'd never actually seen combat, but was chosen to represent them in poetry. Looking at a repression of war experience from Sassoon, who's actually seen combat, the picture of war becomes reshaped in a way that it couldn't back in the days of Tennyson. The picture of the soldier is no longer a noble hero, but a haunted human being. There's no general rhyme scheme, and Sassoon seems to be employing the use of stream of consciousness to show the disruption war has had on his mind. Another theme present in war literature that helped communicate trauma would be the idea of humanism, originally an art movement that ditched the one-point linear perspective and opted for one that allowed for varying points of view, as we see in the works of Picasso. In terms of war literature, a poem from different authors has different perspectives of the same war. They address and relate to it differently. Wilfred Owens writes the story of war as if he was someone who died in his poem The Strange Meeting. Isaac Rosenberg writes the environment of the war in his poem Louse Hunting. And Sassoon writes the perspective of a bitter survivor. There's no mention of honor or glory, just an honest, differing perspectives of the same war experience. As it was the soldiers' unofficial and unwanted role to explain their condition, it was the civilians' job to listen. Though it was easier said than done for both parties. The book Shell Shock and the Modernist Imagination discusses the years after the war and how a soldier's trauma built up a wall between them and society. The author writes that shell shock was an intensely private experience and hard to represent for other people, especially loved ones, to understand. The book describes this as an unbridgeable gap between combatants and non-combatants. This gap, as the book argues, was met with a silence after the war, a silence that made the soldiers' homecoming feel all the more strange. I like the way the book describes it, as an alien force encountered at the war and brought home with him. This unknown force of trauma made it that much more difficult for civilians to bring up the topic, and even harder for the soldier to talk about it directly. But I believe that literature was the way to talk about it. What was a tough condition for a soldier to speak about was expressed just as accurately in literature such as Mrs. Dalloway. The post-war experience could be talked about in a narrative setting, in a way that was understandable and digestible to everyone. Civilians were able to see into the soldier's experience of mind without having to deal with the discomfort of asking the soldier himself. And I think Mrs. Dalloway demonstrates the relationship of civilian and soldier in the marriage of Septimus and Lucrezia. Through Woolf's use of stream of consciousness, we understand both Lucrezia and Septimus as they sit together in the park. Septimus doesn't respond to Lucrezia's attempts to take him out of his mind, per Dr. Holmes' request. Rather, he sits there imagining that his fallen comrade Evans is there, only muttering to himself and not communicating with the world around him. Meanwhile, Lucrezia is frustrated. She's desperate for a way to be happier than she currently is. This reflects a common conflict for the couples during World War I and serves as a warning for civilian and soldiers to communicate with one another, lest they never get the chance to, as Septimus and Lucrezia never get to.